Continuing with Marx's analysis of class under capitalism, we're going to, first of all, redefine class, and then we're going to move on to, I think, what is the heart of his entire analysis of capitalism, which is going to be his labor theory of value. So before we get to that, right, let's get my improvised blackboard up here. Here you go. Capitalism, just like any other mode of production, is defined by one basic class relationship. So, said slavery is defined by the relationship between masters and slaves. Feudalism defined by the relationship between landlords and serfs, and capitalism is defined by the relationship between capitalists and workers. So we have the class of capitalists, right, which Marx called the bourgeoisie, and we have the workers, right, which Marx called the proletariat. Now, I will give extra credit to anybody who sends me an email that explains to me, who can let me know, because I think I know, right? But you tell me what the origin of those words are. What's the origin of the word bourgeoisie? What's the origin of the word proletariat? All right. So here we go. So we got the capitalists and the workers. So the capitalists are the owners of the means of production. So it's going to be, they're the ones that own the factories, right? And they're the ones that own the railroads, and they're the ones that own the mines, and they're the ones that own all of society's productive property, right, as their own private property. They own it as capital. And capital is wealth generating, profit generating property. The purpose behind owning capital is to accumulate profits, okay? And so then we have the workers, right? And in a capitalist society, the workers don't own the means of production, right? They don't own anything, right, beyond their personal possessions, their clothes on their back and other personal possessions. But really, all they have in this commodity-based society, in this market-based society, is their labor power. So in order for them to make a living, they have to turn to the capitalists, right, who own the means of production to try to sell their labor for a wage. Now, there are other classes. We said that there are also other classes, and we may fill in one of these classes a little bit later on. But the main, most important relationship within the capitalist mode of production, the most important relation of production, is this relationship between the capitalists and the workers, okay? So the capitalists and the workers are classes. Now, here's what we didn't say about classes yet. When Marx talks about classes, okay, he defines them in two different ways, right? Two different and related ways. First of all, he describes class as an objective reality. So in other words, class is a structural relationship. You either own or you don't own the means of production. That is an objective condition, right? So he called that being a class in itself, right? So the capitalist class is a class in itself. The working class, the proletariat, is a class in itself, okay? Now there's another way that arises from this objective condition, and that is a class, being a class conscious, excuse me, being a class conscious class, right? In other words, this is what he called being a class for itself. So we have class in itself as an objective condition, and then we have class for itself. Class for itself is a class that develops class consciousness. We said that the realities of class define interests, right? Define, let's say, political interests. It's in the political interest of the capitalist class to maintain the conditions under which they are privileged, right? And it's in the interest of the working class to maintain the conditions under which they, or excuse me, it is in the interest of the working class to abolish, right, the conditions under which they are exploited. That is what should be in their historical interest. Okay, so uh, uh, when classes recognize their political interest, they recognize that they share in common interests as members of a class, we can say they are a class conscious class, right? The workers can become a class conscious class. They can collectively recognize their common exploitation and then organize themselves to do something about it, right? And that's what capitalism does not want, right? Capitalists do not want workers to become a class conscious class. And well, how that's going to be accomplished, we'll talk about that a little bit later on, right? But we have this idea of class and class consciousness, another very important thing to Marx. Right now, let's get to what I'm going to consider the heart, right, the centerpiece of Marx's analysis of capitalism, and that's his thing that he calls the labor theory of value. Okay, so the whole question is, how do I get you to work for me and not for yourself? How do I get you to produce wealth for me? Okay, now how is that accomplished under slavery? How do I get you to work for me? How do I get you, a slave, to produce my wealth? Through force. Work or I'll kill you, right? Same thing under feudalism. How do I get you to work for me and not for yourself? How do I get you to produce my wealth? Coercion, okay? Capitalism is a little bit different, okay? How do I get you to work for me and not for yourself? Through the system of wage labor. How do I get you to produce my wealth? Through the system of wage labor. And it has to do with the idea that the capitalists own the means of production and the working class does not. Okay? So I'm going to get this diagram back here again. Right, so we have the capitalist class and we have the working class, and they are tied together through the arrangement, through the system of wage labor. Okay, so remember what the wage is. The wage is the price of labor power, right? So the workers not owning the means of production, which are also the means of livelihood, have to turn to the capitalists to try to sell their labor power for a wage. Okay. Now, out of that arrangement is going to come surplus value. What workers are going to have to do in the factory in order to get their wage is to produce surplus value for the capitalists. And then that surplus value is going to be converted, right, into profit. So through the system of wage labor, the capitalists are going to appropriate surplus value and then take that surplus value and convert it into profit, okay? So here's how it works, all right? First of all, Marx he describes the nature of wage labor. How is wage labor different than other systems that came before it, than other modes of labor exploitation that came before it, like serfdom and slavery? Okay, now here's how it's different. It's different in three ways, all right? Number one, Marx calls wage labor free labor, okay? Not because the capitalists are getting it for nothing, right? He calls it free labor because in a capitalist society, wage labor is legally free, all right? You are under no legal obligation like a slave or like a serf to work, okay? In a wage labor system, you are free, number one, to try to sell your labor to the highest bidder, okay? And you are also free, right, not to work at all, okay? If you want to, if I decided that I no longer wanted to work at UPJ, I could go to the president's office and I can say, I quit. I can give my notice, right? And I could quit because the University of Pittsburgh at Johnstown doesn't own me, right? So maybe it feels like that sometimes, but they don't own me, right? So I can go leave whenever I want to do nothing, to do something else. It doesn't matter, okay? So workers are not uh, owned, right? They're not under obligation to any particular capitalist. They can sell their labor to the highest bidder, or they can decide not to work at all. All right. Now, the corollary to that is that capital is also under no obligation to its workers, right? Capital is under no obligation to its employees. So if a company, let's say, decides that it's no longer profitable to maintain its labor force, they can just let people go, right? They don't have to worry about that. You know, if United States Steel Corporation or Bethlehem Steel Corporation decided that it's no longer profitable to make steel in Johnstown, they can just shut their factories down and lay off all their workers, fire all their workers, right? They're not under obligation. They're not under any kind of obligation to their labor force. So this idea that workers are legally free, you know, and capital is also free. But in this case, we're talking about workers, right? Workers are legally free, right? If I'm working at McDonald's for $7.25 an hour, right? Whatever the minimum wage is right now, right? If I'm working at McDonald's for $7.25 an hour, and you know, Wendy's across the street puts up a sign that says they're now hiring people for $8 an hour, then I can tell Ronald McDonald to stick it up his clown ass, and I can go across the street and get my application and see if they'll hire me, right? That's what we mean when we say that labor is legally free. Workers are legally free. That's number one. Number two, workers are legally free, but there's always a big but, right? Workers are legally free, but they are separated from the means of production. Okay, they're separated from the means of production. They don't own the means of production. That's different. It's different than serfdom. You know, under feudalism, right? You know, the serf maybe didn't own the land and worked the land for the landlord, but serfs also had a certain amount of access to what was called common land that they collectively owned, right? And they could sort of work it together. They could raise their own food on it, or they could herd their own or pasture their own animals on it, right? And so they had some access to productive property. Even think about like the medieval craftsman, okay? Not even thinking about like the medieval farmer, right? The serf. Think about the medieval craftsman, you know, the wheelwright, you know, or whatever it was, the blacksmith. They own their own tools, right? They own their own means of production. But under capitalism, the workers don't own the factories that they work in, and they don't own the machinery, right, that they use. That's owned by somebody else. That's owned by the capitalist. So they are legally free, right? But they are separated from the means of production. Okay. Now they're separated from the means of production, but they're not separated from need. They need things, right? They need food, they need shelter, they need clothes, they got to put shoes on their kids' feet, right? You know? So they need things. So they're not free from need. They're legally free, but they're not free from need. So that means that need drives them to the labor market, right? It's that need that drives them to the labor market. So, you know, they are compelled, they have to turn to the capitalists, right, and try to sell their labor to the capitalists. Now, it wasn't Marx, but it was Marxists after him who talked about the wage labor system as the words they used were, they called it wage slavery. Okay, wage slavery, different than actual slavery. So I'm not a slave to any particular master under capitalism. But if I can put it like really crudely and crassly, I am a slave to my paycheck, right? I'm a slave to my pay envelope because I have needs, okay? And unless I can sell my labor to the capitalist, then I'm not going to be able to meet those basic needs that I have, okay? Everybody follow that there? So I'm not, I'm a slave basically to my paycheck, okay? And that's another way of saying that I'm a slave to my needs, right? Weber, who, by the way, Max Weber, who, was not a Marxist by any means. In fact, all kinds of disagreements with Marx. He's in that debate with Marx's ghost, and he's got a lot of problems, right, with Marx's work. But he did agree with the way Marx understood the wage labor system. And when Weber talked about Marx's discussion of the wage labor system, Weber said this. He said, under capitalism, workers are forced under compulsion of the whip of hunger, right, to sell their labor. Compulsion of the whip of hunger. It's a figurative whip, right? It's not a literal whip. So we're not free from need. So now I have to turn to the capitalist for a job, okay, in order to feed myself, clothe myself, put shoes on my kids' feet, keep a roof over my head, all that stuff, okay? And I think what's ironic here is that since I don't own the means of production, and the capitalist owns the means of production, that means that anything I make in his factory, I also don't own. The capitalist owns it, right? And so what I'm basically doing is I'm selling my labor power to a capitalist for a wage so that then I can go onto the market and buy the stuff that I just got done making in the factory, okay? That's basically how it works. So here I go. So I turn to the capitalist for a job. I say, I need a job. And the capitalist says, sure, okay, we'll hire you, all right? And but here's the deal, right? Since the capitalist class, we're going to talk in terms of class. I shouldn't be talking in terms of individuals. The capitalist class, since they own the means of production and the workers don't, they're in a better position, right? The capitalists are in a better position to dictate the conditions under which I'm going to sell my labor, okay? The capitalist class is in a better position to dictate the conditions under which the working class will sell its labor. All right. So here are the conditions. Okay. You work and I'll pay you, or we will pay you, right? But you, workers, are not going to receive in your paycheck a value equal to the total value that you create. So every day, workers are going to the factories and they are creating value, right? And a lot of that value is unpaid, right? A lot of the value they create is unpaid for, okay? And Marx called that surplus value. So in the factories, workers are creating surplus value, okay? They're going to get paid, right, a wage, but their wage is not going to be equal. The value of their wage is not going to be equal to the total value of everything that they produce, okay? And that's going to be surplus value. So I wanted to read, I got James Russell's Introduction to Sociology textbook, and I like it because he puts this in really simple terms for you here. And he's talking about the labor theory of value. And he says, Marx, let's read this here. I'm going to read this to you. He said, Marx powerfully argued that exploitation was the lever of capitalist accumulation. Okay. According to his labor theory of value, the key premise of Marxian economic theory, all economic value in capitalist societies results from the labor of those who directly work on products. Okay, all value results from the labor of those who directly work on products. Stock owners, speculators, financiers, and other members of the capitalist class control but do not produce surplus value. Workers produce more value each working day, right, than the amount of value which capitalists invest in their wages and other costs of production. All right. Marx called this extra sum produced by workers surplus value. Hence, workers produce but do not receive surplus value. Rather, capitalists exploit workers by expropriating the surplus value that they have produced. Okay, so what does all that mean? All right, well, capitalists, they're going to invest capital, right? They're going to invest capital. So what are they investing in? Well, they're going to invest in what Marx called constant capital. So they're going to invest in the factory building, and they're going to invest in the machinery, and they're going to invest in the raw materials and so forth. And then they're also going to invest in what he calls variable capital, and that's going to be what they're investing in wages. So what Russell is saying and what Marx is saying is that, okay, they're going to lay out money for their building machinery and raw materials, and they're also going to be laying out money for wages. And when all those costs are put together, right, workers still, when they get their wage, right, workers still are not receiving the full value of everything that they produce. So there's a gap there, and that difference between the value that the workers produce and the value that the workers get paid for is called surplus value, right? And now it's that surplus value that's going to be converted into profit. So here's how I want you to think about surplus value. The workers go to work every day and they make stuff. Let's say they make shoes. So they take these, raw materials, leather and string and all that stuff, right? And laces and they make shoes. And by taking those pieces and putting them together, now they've created value, right? They have a shoe that now has use and value, all right? And so they create this value. And where does it go? It goes into the warehouse, okay? The workers don't own it. They don't own those shoes, right? Those 14-year-old Indonesian girls that are making Nike sneakers, they don't own those sneakers that they're making, right? It's surplus value owned by the capitalists. They own it. So surplus value is what's sitting in the warehouse, right? And surplus value is what's sitting on the store shelves, okay? In order for that surplus value that the workers have made to become profit, something special has to happen. It has to be sold, okay? Somebody has to buy it, okay? You follow me? Somebody's got to buy it, right? And when workers make surplus value and then somebody buys the surplus value that the workers make, Marx calls that the realization of surplus value. So now that surplus value returns to the capitalist in the form of profit. Okay, everybody get that? So that difference between the value that workers produce and the value that they get paid for returns to the capitalist in the form of profit when it is sold. Okay, everybody okay with that? All right, so that's Marx's labor theory of value. Now, It's in that labor theory of value that the main, most important contradiction of capitalism is contained. Okay? And that's what we'll talk about in the next segment.